Week 1, Unit 1. Exercise 1. When temperatures near 0 degrees Celsius, water molecules start bonding with one another to form a crystal structure. The hydrogen atoms of each molecule connect to the oxygen atoms of other molecules. The resulting structure creates a greater amount of space between the molecules than there was when the molecules floated freely about in a liquid state. All that extra space between the molecules is why ice is less dense than liquid water, and the reason ice floats. This characteristic of water is good news for fish and other animals that live underwater, wherever the temperatures drop to freezing. When the water in a lake, for instance, begins to freeze, the first tiny ice crystals that form remain on the surface. Eventually, a layer of floating ice will form on the water's surface, which seals in the liquid water below and keeps it from freezing. If water became more dense when it froze, the way most substances do, then the ice crystals would keep sinking to the bottom. Eventually, the entire lake would be frozen solid from top to bottom, which would be bad news for the fish. Exercise 2. I witnessed a surprising set of behaviors between a group of chimpanzees with whom I periodically interacted. Sarah likes to look at books, so when I visit, I occasionally bring her children's books that can withstand chimpanzee handling for at least a few minutes. I gave Sarah her book, and before she could really start reading it, Harper, who at this point in time was older but still mischievous, came over and took it away. Sarah didn't struggle with Harper when he took it. Then, moments later, Sheba, a very smart female chimpanzee who didn't appear to me to have noticed Harper's behavior because she was happily eating her dried mangoes, went over to Harper and took the book from him. This in itself wouldn't be surprising, as taking things that others have is typical among members of a group that aren't clearly dominant. What was surprising was that rather than keeping it herself, she promptly gave it back to Sarah. There were no vocalizations that I was aware of that might indicate Sarah was distressed by Harper's thievery, nor that Sheba was trying to appease any distress. It just looked to me as though Sheba was setting things right. No one told her what to do. She just autonomously determined that the book belonged to Sarah. Exercise 3. One dimension of the mind's innate search for meaning has to do with the compelling power of purpose. For example, a girl of about 9 years old recently described what she understood to be the causes and best treatment for lung cancer. She was extremely articulate. Her interest had been sparked by the fact that her mother had been diagnosed with the disease, prompting her to read as much as she could find on the subject. Learning that is reducible to memorizing facts that are true or false is different from learning that engages actor-centered, adaptive decision-making. This kind of decision-making is the result of an authentic question generated by the learner on the basis of a genuine need to know, and is one that inevitably requires more complex thinking. It is the search for meaning that organizes actor-centered questions and encourages the use of higher-order functions. Exercise 4. My father had a favorite story about social practices which he learned from his father. An enormous herd of sheep was moving down a country road, led by a wise old ram. As the lead sheep approached an intersection, a young lady on a bicycle was approaching on the crossroad. The old ram realized that if she had to wait for all those sheep to cross, she would be delayed for hours. The old ram knew he couldn't stop because of all the sheep pushing from behind. Being the gentleman that he was, he came up with a creative solution. He jumped high in the air, giving her room to pass safely under and continue on her way. Late that night, as the young lady was safely at home and having supper, the sheep were still jumping over the same intersection, but no one knew why. What had started out as a creative idea turned into a senseless institution. Exercise 5. Many improvising actors talk about both the high they get from a good improvisation and the terror they feel when a performance isn't going well. The unpredictability of group creativity can be frightening because failure is public. If a painter fails, he or she can paint over the canvas. A writer can crumple up the paper and throw it away. But imagine if writers had to publish every single one of their manuscripts. That's the situation improv actors find themselves in every night. Mark Gordon, a director of and actor in The Compass Players, said, "It always felt to me like taking your pants off in front of an audience. A little terrifying." Ted Flicker, director of the first St. Louis Compass and founder of the New York group The Premise, said, "Unless you've actually tasted what improvising in front of an audience feels like, you can't imagine the horror of it." Exercise 6. Dr. Zionce's drive theory claims that the mere presence of an audience is arousing, and that this increases the tendency to produce dominant responses. If the dominant responses are appropriate or correct in relation to the task, performance will be enhanced. But if inappropriate, performance will be impaired compared to when the person performs the task alone. This means that tasks we are skilled at, which are well learned and of which we have a long history of experience, are likely to be enhanced in front of an audience. In contrast, tasks at which we are not skilled, or those in the early stages of learning, will be performed even more poorly in front of an audience. Take the example of teaching. Zionce's drive theory predicts that an experienced, skilled teacher will do well in front of a class. On the other hand, a new teacher may practice and rehearse at home and be satisfied with his or her performance. However, when the new teacher has to stand in front of a class, he or she is likely to perform poorly, both according to his or her own expectations and to those of the students in the class. Exercise 7. Although certainly not limited to America, the tall tale found fertile soil in what is now the United States, perhaps most notably in reference to the western frontier, which lent itself to hyperbole. As a result of the seemingly limitless horizon, the vast forests, the powerful rivers, and the other incredible natural features of the landscape of a largely unsettled America, a narrative genre that took exaggeration as its fundamental principle was utterly reborn in American storytelling. The Tall Tale is, first and foremost, an engaging and entertaining story about characters of utterly outsized proportions, a story of the biggest, the baddest, and the best. Classically told with a straight face and a just-the-facts manner, the wildly exaggerated content of the Tall Tale is often related with ostentatious language, in sharp contrast to its dry delivery. Considering the American cultural emphasis on greatness, it perhaps should come as no surprise that the genre of the Tall Tale has long struck a resonant chord in the American mind. Exercise 8. After images can produce simultaneous contrast effects. If these are illusory colors, they nonetheless do much of the work of real colors, so much so that one can set up situations in which after-image colors will be taken to be the colors of particular physical objects, or of the light that illuminates them. For example, one can walk into a room to see a rapidly rotating disk illuminated by a bright light. The surface of the disk is seen to be a homogeneous bluish-green, but when the disk is stopped, it is seen to be half white and half black, with a radial segment cut out at the boundary. If the disk is stopped at a particular angle of rotation, a red light may be seen through the cutout. The color the rotating disk was seen to have was entirely after-image color, produced by the brief flash of red light that occurred at every rotation. When the disk is rapidly turning, the red light is never seen as red. Exercise 9. Hindsight bias has a particular way in which it manifests. Some people refer to hindsight bias as the "I knew it all along" phenomenon. When you hear someone say, "I knew it all along," or "I knew that they would," they're demonstrating hindsight bias. When this happens, we are selectively recalling an experience that supports the facts we have just learned, and, in actuality, we didn't know. We were simply emboldened by the recently revealed facts to believe that we did. For instance, when a new hire is doing a good job, it is common for us to tell our coworkers that we knew that person was going to do well, when, in fact, we did not know. We were just hoping. Likewise, if that same person starts performing poorly, we are likely, without any critical reflection of our previous comments, to say, "I knew they weren't going to work out." Hindsight bias allows us to think that we are better at predicting than we really are. Exercise 10. The green movement is sometimes criticized for downplaying the cost of going green. Just as food movements have sometimes acted unaware of the difficulty of a working-class family negotiating not only its food budget, but also the effect on that budget of the time constraints of working parents, so too did the early environmentalism movement sometimes pay too little attention to the financial effect of environmentally responsible behavior. Recycling was an easy win, because wartime rationing had conditioned people for it, and the gains were obvious and short-term. Switching to energy-saving light bulbs is fairly easy to convince people to do, because of their longevity and the obvious long-term savings. Reducing water usage is more difficult, particularly given how low water bills tend to be relative to other utilities. A change in behavior may amount to only a few dollars a month, and those few dollars may seem like a more than reasonable price for longer showers and a well-watered lawn. Even water conservation is only asking for a behavioral change, however, and perhaps the expense of a low-pressure showerhead. Asking people to spend money on going green has historically been difficult. Exercise 11. It's amazing how much you can learn about your friends and family, your job, the organization you work in, and yourself when you decide to really listen to others. But not everyone understands this benefit. For example, we heard a story about a tennis pro who was giving a lesson to a new student. After watching the novice take several swings at the tennis ball, the pro stopped him and suggested ways he could improve his stroke. But each time he did, the student interrupted him and gave his opinion of the problem and how it should be solved. After several interruptions, the pro began to nod his head in agreement. When the lesson ended, a woman who had been watching said to the pro, "Why did you go along with that arrogant man's stupid suggestions?" The pro smiled and replied, "I learned a long time ago that it is a waste of time to try to sell real answers to anyone who just wants to buy echoes. Beware of putting yourself into a position where you think you know all the answers. Any time you do, you'll be putting yourself in danger. It's almost impossible to think of yourself as the expert and continue growing and learning at the same time." Exercise 12. The quality of a decision cannot be determined unambiguously by its outcome. For example, most of us believe it would be foolish to accept a bet that the next time we throw a pair of dice, we will roll snake eyes. The actual chance of throwing 2 ones, snake eyes, is 1 in 36. Moreover, we would regard the person who accepted such a bet as a poor decision-maker, even if he or she happened to roll snake eyes. On the other hand, if that person were in danger of physical harm or death at the hands of a loan shark, and that bet were the only way to raise enough money to avoid harm, then the person might not seem so foolish. What this example illustrates is that it is the potential outcomes, their probabilities, and their values to the decision maker at the time the decision is made that lead us to judge a particular choice to be wise or foolish. A general who is losing a war, for example, is much wiser to engage in a high-risk military venture than is a general who is winning a war. The failure of such a venture might not reflect unfavorably on the decision-making ability of the losing general. It is more rational for the losing general to take a risk.